Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. You are listening to Casey and Isabel's literary microfiction podcast. Today we have a wonderful show planned out for you. Joining us is Isabel. How are you feeling today, Isabel?
I'm doing good.
Fantastic to hear that. So, today we are discussing The Things They Carried by O'Brien. What's his first name again?
Tim.
Tim O'Brien. Fantastic writer. Our story today is about men journeying through Vietnam and the metaphorical and literal weight that they carried on their backs. Now, jumping right into it, question 1 to Isabel. How does the character Martha juxtapose Lieutenant Cross's world with the one he left behind?
Well, I think the most interesting thing about Martha's role in this story is that she represents the tangible and intangible things that Lieutenant Cross carries. At the beginning of the story, it explains how he's carrying letters from her, which by the end he ends up letting go of. But throughout the whole story, and continuing all the way until the end, he keeps with him the emotional burden that comes with Martha and the love life he left behind.
Fantastic answer. Now, I also had a similar response to the same question. And I think that because Martha's college life back in the States is so sheltered from the horrors experienced by these men in Vietnam that it cannot help but paint a very different picture of the two worlds that they live in. Black versus white, or should I say, the plated skirts and tests of college life compared to the hellish bombings and firefights of Vietnam. Now, question 2. To Isabel, how does the death of Lavender lead Lieutenant Cross to take better care of his men and realize his relationship with Martha is more fantasy than reality?
Well, when looking at this question, I think that the answers to this question and the first one are quite similar. But after the death of Lavender, Lieutenant Cross realizes that the relationship he had with Martha was more of a fantasy than a reality. Especially now that he is at war, there's no room for having any emotional burdens or any other distractions besides his one role as a lieutenant. So he realizes he has to leave behind the fantasy of having a life with Martha and only focus on taking care of his men.
Very true indeed. And I also had a similar response that guilt can be a powerful thing. The lieutenant is using the pain he feels and channeling it into taking better care of his men. This also highlights the fact that his relationship with Martha contains a rift that cannot be breached. Now.
So next question is, how is the stress of combat displayed through the tangibles that the soldiers actually carry?
Well, it is clear that these men, in the books describing the hundreds of pounds that weighed upon their shoulders, that they would even carry more and more stuff, such as weapons, things like grenades, assault rifles, anything that you could possibly fit into a Call of Duty outload, and they would just grab it all out of fear, for the most part, not to mention some bravado on the side, but it's very clear that fear is certainly a large attribute of the story displayed clearly with both the lieutenant's fear of Martha not loving him, his fear for his men, and the fear of him losing his own life in that hellish Vietnam.
Yeah, as you pointed out, how fear is a huge component in the tangible objects they carry. I think pointing out all the tangible things they carry helps the reader notice the intangible things that they also carry throughout the war.
Absolutely. Now, we've got our last question for here today before we dutifully say goodbye to all of our wonderful listeners. Last one to Isabel. How does the author, constantly giving the weight of the objects, also contribute to the idea of metaphorical weight? What do you have to say about that?
Well, I thought that because I noticed how throughout the whole thing the author is very detailed when explaining all the tangible objects that the soldiers carry. And O'Brien continues to give their exact weight while also conveying the stress and brutality that gives the soldiers the intangible things they carry. I think that giving the literal weights of the tangible objects helps emphasize how heavy and how much of an impact the intangible objects really have.
I cannot agree more, Isabel. Thank you so much for joining us today. Before you leave, I'm going to add one more thing on what you said, and that is that the things that these soldiers carry in their minds will always weigh more than what they carry on their backs.